Well, hello and welcome to the Chinwag. I am your host, Paolo Giamatti, and
Paolo.
Yes, indeed.
Very good.
Allow me to introduce my colleague, Professor Stephen Asma.
Thank you,
sir.
very good to see you, my man.
Really nice to see you.
This is going to be a very special and twisted episode.
This is going to be a very special and twisted episode because the spotlight, in a sense, or perhaps the hot lights, are going to be aimed on my colleague, Professor Stephen Asma, professor of philosophy, I believe. Am I correct in this assumption?
You are correct, sir.
Indeed. And you have your PhD in philosophy.
Yes, and philosophy means technically love of wisdom. So
nice.
I have a PhD in the love of wisdom, which doesn't sound arrogant at all. It's incredibly...
It doesn't. What's wrong with love of knowledge? It doesn't sound arrogant. If you had a PhD and I know fucking everything or something like that, that would be arrogant. But you're not. It's love of knowledge is not the same thing as I know everything.
That's
true.
And in fact, that is true.
And in fact, I mean, as a philosopher, you're sort of saying to yourself, you're looking into everything. You're interested in everything.
It's supposed to have some humility. Yeah, for sure. It's supposed to. But if you know any philosophers, you'll know that they missed that memo.
Really? Is it generally does it attract a lot of know-it-alls, guys who are
It's funny, like a lot of younger people who study philosophy are just insufferable. But as they get older and life hands them one sort of tragedy after another, it takes the edges off them. They're better.
Could I be so bold as to say, once it starts handing them one tragedy after another, they probably become better philosophers.
They do, and
right?
Yes, and they lose some of the arrogance and they do become better philosophers. I think that's exactly right.
I like that. That's interesting. Well, I mean, my idea was to sort of. Because I'm half-assed in my knowledge of everything. You know, I have a love of knowledge, but it's pretty half-assed. And so, and I've always been sort of interested in philosophy. I find it an interesting pursuit. I find the people who do it interesting. I find the whole thing interesting. And so I thought we'd have an episode that I like to call Ask the Philosopher.
Ask the Philosopher.
Which is where I'm going to put you on the hot seat and finally get to the bottom of this whole philosophy thing. And get the answers.
Well, if our listeners are also interested in philosophy, they need to head down and rank and review us at Apple Podcasts, because that is a sign of philosophical devotion.
That is nice.
Are you giving us the 5 stars? Mm-hmm. Please get on down there, please.
If you love philosophy, you go down there and you give us the 5 stars. You give us a good rating. You know, questions, conundrums. I mean, hell, after you listen to this, you're going to want to ask a lot of questions. You're going to want to know from Steve the answer to everything. But no, I just
put them right in the review.
A little bit of a little, or just bang this off to a friend of yours. Just text this right now to someone that you know.
Send this to that strange friend of yours who is interested in ideas,
philosophy, and ideas, and knowledge. Who loves knowledge. And really, who doesn't love knowledge, Steve? I mean, is there anybody really who doesn't love a little knowledge? But I just thought it would be nice to take a little tour through it now. And I would hasten to add, although you can certainly correct me about this, that what we're going to talk about is Western philosophy.
We can talk about, because it's too big to go east. There's a great tradition, but we could save that for another Chinwag.
We totally can. Holy mackerel.
Queue up the East.
Now, do you feel qualified to do it if you did teeing up the East? Do you feel like you'd be qualified to talk about the Eastern stuff too?
I have written 3 books on Buddhism, so I do know a thing or two.
There we go.
I'm still consider myself a student, but compared to a lot of American philosophy professors, I have sort of studied a lot more Hinduism and Buddhism, and also because I lived in China so long, I have studied Confucianism and Taoism to some extent. So,
and it's interesting because, and this is something we can obviously get into as we embark on this exciting episode of Ask the Philosopher. But it's interesting because when you, I mean, this is just something we could talk about quickly now, and maybe as we go along. But it's interesting because when you say Eastern philosophy, it seems intricately bound up in the religions in the East. And I can remember when I once studied Zen a bit, and I went to a monastery. I studied it like I'm making this up. I went to a monastery for like a week once.
In Japan? Was this in Japan?
No. This was in upstate New York. New York. But it was interesting because there was a big debate about whether Zen Buddhism was a religion or a philosophy. Whether it was, that could be an interesting thing for you to answer right now. Is there a difference?
Yeah, it's both. If you look at if you look at the scriptures like of Christianity, let's say, you're going to see Jesus telling stories, and he's like, okay, a guy goes to here and he can't get through the eye of a needle or whatever. But in Buddhism, the actual scriptures, which are written in Sanskrit or Pali, are actually philosophical arguments. Like the Buddha's actually like premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. It's really very logical.
Huh.
But so that you could study Buddhism like a philosophy, but of course, if you go to a Buddhist country, it's also a religion. It's a devotional practice. You go to the temple and light incense. You pray to the Buddha, even though technically he's not a god. So it's really a mix of religion and philosophy, and sometimes they converge, and sometimes they're very different.
Interesting. And this is, again, I've gotten us off the topic, but I just want to ask. It's interesting when I hear people say things like the difference between a sort of mystical school of thought and a religious school of thought. And I'm always like, okay, I always just thought one was a kind of variant of the other. I always thought mysticism was a kind of form of religion. Yeah. And that they're not different things. Are they a little?
Well, I tend to agree with you on this. I think the religion is the broader umbrella. And then you can have like liturgical religion, which is focused on the text and like the sort of sayings at the temple or whatever, and the rituals. And then you can have the mystical traditions under that same umbrella. It's oftentimes the mystics are thought of as like the bohemians and the kind of hippies of the religion. So my friends of mine who are Muslim think of, the Sufi mystic branch of Islam as being sort of the hippie version. And even in Japan, a lot of people are Buddhists of a kind of Pure Land school, they call it. And they think of the Zen people as kind of the hippies. Oh, so really? Every religion has its mystics, and they tend to be the kind of outsiders. You kind of tolerate them. They're interesting. It's the odd guy, who is sort of like doing his own thing, but it's part of religion.
But it's not necessarily less rigorous than religion. I mean, because I think of Zen as actually the most rigorous school of, or I shouldn't say that, but it's like, what do I know? But it seems like a very rigorous school of Buddhism.
It is. It's more about the direct experience of you and God or the nothing or whatever it is. Like it's not mediated by priests and by rabbis or anything like that. It's really about a direct experience that you have with God or the spirit.
And is that a bit of a difference between a religion and a mystical tradition in that you're in a religion, you're going through, it's being mediated by priests or whatever, usually, by somebody who's a specialist in the thing has to sort of guide you through it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's one of the main differences. Mystics believe that they can have some kind of direct religious experience where they feel touched by God or the Spirit or something. That sounds a little, but if you're religious, you're oftentimes sort of, lay people. They have families. They go to church once a week or temple or whatever it is. They're about the ceremony and the devotion, whereas oftentimes the monks and the nuns, they are more of the mystics because they're kind of full-timers.
Interesting.
In that sense.
Okay. Well, listen, this is already, Ask the Philosopher.
We're off to a great start.
For me, Ask the Philosopher is working already because I'm like, okay, that actually clears something up that I've often wondered, and I was too stupid on my own to actually know the answer to.
No.
So no. I have the empty mind now, Steve. I am the man with the empty mind, coming to have it filled with wisdom by you.
That's the goal, is to achieve emptiness. Yeah, in Buddhism, for sure, and Taoism.
So to start off, though, in the Western tradition of philosophy, there's a whole, if we go all the way back to what I guess would be the beginnings of it, which is the Greeks, right?
Yeah.
So the ancient Greeks. And, we all know of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, right? Who are the kind of foundational guys for sort of a lot of Western thinking and Western philosophy. But there's guys before that, right?
Yeah. Yep. before Socrates.
I always remember taking class in college and then subsequently always finding these guys actually really interesting. And tell me a little bit about what they called these guys, and then we can talk about maybe what the deal was with them.
Yeah.
And when are we talking about with these guys?
Okay.
How long ago?
Well, Socrates is living in I think he's basically like in the 4th century BCE. So like almost 400 years before Jesus. And basically what's called the pre-Socratics are these guys you're talking about that came before Socrates, and they're like in, between 500 and 600 roughly BCE. We don't really know exactly. And this is a problem in the East too. There's some of these people are just legendary. They're talked about much later, but we don't even know their exact dates.
And are they at the same time as sort of like the Buddha and stuff like that? Or is that?
Yeah, actually some of these people like in the West, pre-Socratics would be people like Parmenides or Heraclitus, Pythagoras even, but he's a little later, Thales, Anaxagoras. Those guys in the Greek world are basically contemporaries with the Buddha in India and Confucius in China and Lao Tzu also in China. They're all about the same time.
Amazing.
It is, yeah. That alone is kind of incredible.
That is incredible. I didn't realize those guys were all at the same time. And it's kind of interesting because what I remember of these guys, I was saying to you last night when we were talking about this, they seem like mystics to me almost more than what I think of as philosophers. They all sort of had these kind of really interesting poetic sort of like theories of the world and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, each of them sort of in a different way.
Some of them are real mystics, and some of them, they seem like mystics because all we have is like a fragment. So it just looks fucking mysterious.
Right.
Because we just got 2 sentences from this guy.
Really?
And yeah, and so like we only have like a few fragments from Heraclitus. And
who's really interesting to me, who I think is really interesting.
So you ran into him in school or just on your own reading?
I did, and I thought in school, and then I remembered reading about him subsequently. But he's a guy who, there's only little bits of information, and they're fragments, and they're almost like poetry.
They are. It's like finding like a few stanzas of a poem. And one of the things he says is, you cannot step in the same river twice.
Right. He's that guy.
And so he means like everything is always changing. And so all of reality is always becoming and transforming, and it's never stable or static. And so he basically thought the sooner you realize that, the better you're going to be able to live with all this change. So he thought it was therapeutic to think this way.
That almost sounds like Buddhism in some ways.
Yeah, there is something, it's very much like Buddhism and even more like Taoism, which says there's the way, and the way or the Tao is always flowing like water. And the trick is not to resist it, but to go with the flow. And then you'll be able to, it's sort of like as an actor, we've talked about this before, like you get in the zone. And the way you do that is not by fighting with nature, but trying to be in harmony with this flow of nature. And so you see Heraclitus making a similar kind of claim in the Greek world.
And did he have a whole sort of idea that, again, I vaguely remember this stuff, that kind of fire was the sort of basic element of everything?
That's right. Very good, man.
Right? I mean, because I always thought that was really cool, that it was like this idea that the heart of everything was fire. And this idea of everything changing constantly, and sort of like, and it made me think of like Hinduism and like, who's that god? Shiva, who's sort of creating and destroying at the same time. And that's cool.
Yeah, fire is really important in Hinduism too, like in the Vedas, in the Upanishads. And and like Heraclitus is saying, look at fire, it's never the same from one moment to the next. And like the guy, he's sort of following an even earlier guy. This is the very first philosopher named Thales. Thales, Thales, super interesting. We know almost nothing about him except he said that everything is water.
Amazing. And again, I hear that and I go, he's right too. Like, you know what I mean? And that's really cool. But did he say anything further? Was there anything more about why because it's a similar idea, because everything flows?
And everything flows, but also like water is able to transform like into, like if you see it in its natural state, liquidy, that's one thing. But if you heat it up, it seems to turn into air, like steam. So, and also if you freeze it, it turns into a solid. So people think what Aristotle thought what he was up to was trying to show that underneath all the changes of nature is some kind of underlying substance. And that's the unified thing that goes through all these changes. And then they all got excited about this and tried to name different shit that was the ultimate substrate.
Right.
It was like fire, water.
So the idea was to find the key to everything by saying it's all this
elements.
or it's all that. That's so interesting.
And that stuff, earth, air, fire, water, that's universal. Like in China, they're also using the same elements. So that's something interesting, and that's popular
and in their
all the way
mind,
until
all
chemistry.
of reality, everything was formed out of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water.
Yeah, except one exception might be the sort of magic tradition adds the 5th element, which is Aristotle calls it pneuma, which is like a breath of life. And then later the medieval mystics and stuff are talking about it as like an ether. So that's a sort of a side tradition.
Right. I think also so I did Hamlet, there's the quintessence is the 5th element, which is sort of the essence of all of them, I think is the idea. Because Hamlet talks about this quintessence of dust. Man is the ultimate sort of like, but quintessence, I guess, was a 5th element.
Actually, that's really cool because I didn't think about that, but Shakespeare is no different, really. The world of his plays, the physical world, is not much different than Aristotle's. It's only after Shakespeare that you get the rise of what we would call chemistry.
Well, hold on, hold your horses. Hold your horses. What other guys are interesting there? What other sort of pre-Socratics? Because I know there were a lot of wacky guys. And are there any others who had an interesting sort of take?
One guy we should at least mention is Parmenides, although I got a quick story about Pythagoras, which is,
I always love a good anecdote about Pythagoras. You got my attention.
Pythagoras, he slays. Okay, so everybody knows the Pythagorean theorem and they learn the math, and they just dread it. Like, who the fuck is this guy? Why do we care?
Yeah.
But he was so much more interesting because he was sort of a cult leader or a religious leader during his time. Like he had influences from Egypt, and he brought them to the Greek-speaking world, and he had ideas about reincarnation that people don't ever really talk about. So he thought that souls transmigrate from one life to another.
Really?
And he even thought, like, he said, the breath, the soul is like a kind of fine breath that's in the body. And so the Pythagoreans said, you cannot eat beans.
That's right.
Because beans will make gas in you. Yep. And that means that you're actually, in the bean, you're actually consuming the souls of other creatures. And as you're breaking wind, you're shooting out souls
of
other creatures.
And your own soul probably too, right?
Yeah, you might be jeopardizing your own soul.
Your own soul. And that, my friends, is philosophy right there.
There's the Chinwag.
There it is. Thank you for coming to the Chinwag.
One quick backup is Parmenides. It's worth mentioning this guy because his view was really weird. He thought the opposite of Heraclitus. There's no motion. There's no change. Nothing is becoming. Everything that we experience is an illusion. There's only one real thing, and it's God and the universe, and it never changes, and it's only one thing. It's really bizarre.
Weird. Interesting, though. That's very interesting.
It's really weird.
And so, but he was positing the idea of a single God and of a sort of single universe is God and that kind of thing?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. And the way he gets there is weird. Like he has a student named Zeno that's famous, and Zeno.
I was going to ask about him. Yeah.
Have you heard about Zeno's paradox?
Please tell me more about Zeno.
Okay, if you were to go from here to the other side of the room, you think, okay, I get up and I walk over there. What's the problem? But Zeno says, yeah, but if you're going to go from here to the other side of the room, you have to logically go half that distance, right? Makes sense. But if you have to go half that distance, you can see where this is going.
Yep.
Then in order to get halfway, you also then have to cover half of that distance, a quarter. And to go half of that, you have to go half and go half and half and half. And he says, if you think about it, space is infinitely divisible. Like there's an infinite amount of space between you and the first step you need to take to cross the room. So they were like, so their minds are kind of blown by this. Because even
so
if you think
theory,
of like an atom.
in theory, you fire an arrow and it shouldn't actually go anywhere.
Right.
In
so
theory,
they said
nothing
all
really
motion is illusion.
It's an illusion.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It's not really happening.
That's so weird.
Because nothing can really change. I don't know. It's a mind fuck.
I love to think of the idea of all these fucking guys walking around at the same time. We're just like, nope, nope, nope. It's all fire. Nope, you're not actually moving, my friend. I mean, all these guys just like bump. That's all water.
I know, you're like, thanks a lot.
Yeah, holy crap. I mean, it's just hilarious. It's so fascinating. And there's guys, is this also like the Stoic? No, the Stoics are later, but like the Cynics and the Diogenes and guys like that. Can you talk about him a little bit?
Yeah, there's like, once you get to Socrates, then you have sort of like a bunch of, you have that sort of triune trinity that you mentioned. Socrates teaches Plato. Socrates never writes anything down. Plato writes the dialogues. Plato teaches Aristotle. And during that time period, you have all these other sort of smaller philosophers that don't get as much attention. Diogenes and other people who are skeptics and cynics. They think you can't know anything. Like there's a famous skeptic named Cratylus, and the legend is that he wouldn't speak at all. He lived in a cave, and they just would go around his house, and the legend was he would just make one gesture with his hand, and nobody knew what the gesture was.
I love it. That's so awesome. That's so fucking insane.
That's hilarious.
It's just crazy. And it's like, God, it sounds so awesome. You could just, all bets are off. You can wander around, just do any fucking crazy thing you feel like doing. That's hilarious. It's just one gesture.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Because what's the point to any of it? Language and all of it is just sort of made up, an illusion. Diogenes has always interested me. He's the guy who lived in a barrel and sort of walked around naked and walked around with a lantern looking for an honest man. And he was he was a kind of wit too. He kind of had all these witty sort of sayings and stuff too, right? And everything was very sort of challenging, and he just called bullshit on everything. Wasn't that sort of Diogenes?
He was a cynic. Technically, I think they call him a cynic.
Right.
And he would basically call all the social conventions that everybody observes like bullshit. Like, why do you do it? Why do people wear these kinds of clothing? Why do you eat this kind of food?
Right.
Why do you
questioning everything. And I think this is interesting, is that I think cynic, the word, is related to the Greek word for dog, isn't it? And it's
I think it is, yeah.
Because he was viewed as sort of a dog, as like kind of like scrapping around, right? I mean, it was sort of the name that he sort of happily took on, I think, right?
Because civilized society is just rife with like stupidity from his point of view. Yeah. So rather be like an animal.
I'll tell one anecdote about Diogenes that I know that I really like, and I think it's Alexander the Great. I think Alexander the Great had come to wherever Diogenes lived, and he sort of said, I want to meet this great man, Diogenes. I want to meet this famous thinker, Diogenes. So they were like, well, he's usually out like lying on the hill, like kind of like sunbathing. He kind of hangs out there with nothing on, like, and he kind of hangs out there. So Alexander goes out there and sort of approaches him and says, I am here. I am Alexander. I am the most powerful man in the world. And yet before you, I'm nothing. I come before you. You are the wisest man. I hear you're the wisest man. And I think you sound like an amazing man. And everything I hear of you is just astounding. Have you heard this story ever?
No, I haven't. No, this is great.
And he says, and Diogenes is kind of like, So lying there. And Alexander says, so therefore I can put the world at your feet. Anything you want, Diogenes, just ask it of me. What can I give you? Anything you want. And Diogenes looks at him and says, you can get out of my sunlight. How about that?
That's classic.
You can step out of my light, asshole. You're blocking my light. Anyway.
Yeah, I love these guys.
That's
there is a certain breed in philosophy that does this all through the ages. Yeah.
It's great. And it's really hilarious. Anyway, okay, so now you got Socrates, you got Plato, you got Aristotle. And Socrates is the big guy who's sort of
patron saint.
Yeah. Right. And he's sort of using logic, applying things to thinking about issues. And he has this method where he talks through things with students. Right?
Yeah. He thinks you have to have you shouldn't write philosophy. He thinks you should basically drink and talk, like the Chinwag, essentially. That's what he thinks. He would love the Chinwag.
For those at home who aren't aware, we're drinking most of the time through this, heavily.
That's true. And so he thought the trick was, he called it a dialectic, where you say one thing, And I say, well, I don't think that's quite right. How about this? And then I offer like an alternative view. And then together we arrive, like we sort of offer it's basically what people later, like Marx and stuff, called the dialectic too, is like a thesis, a kind of antithesis, and then maybe hopefully a synthesis. But his method was not to necessarily build a system, but to knock down bad knowledge. So he was always trying to like shoot holes in your definition. Like somebody says courage means paying back your debts, and then he would find some way that didn't make sense. And he was irritating. He was a super irritating guy, and they basically executed him.
Yeah, right. That's an interesting definition of courage, by the way. That's really funny. Was that one of the proposed ideas?
No, one of the definitions, that was a definition of justice. Like somebody says, like, what's the definition of justice? And somebody says, well, you have to pay your debts. And he says, well, if that's true, what if you gave me a weapon, like a really great sword? And so I borrowed that from you. And then you came back later the next night and you were drunk and you were like, then you're super irritated. And you're like, I need that fucking sword back right now. He's like, the definition of justice would be you're supposed to give the guy the sword back. But of course, you would never give your drunk friend his sword back in this condition. So that can't be a good definition of justice.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was a nightmare because he questioned everything.
Yeah, he was a total nightmare.
And so they killed him. They basically, the Athenians had him killed because he was a troublemaker, right?
Yeah, they trumped up charges that he was corrupting the youth and he didn't believe in the traditional gods. And then what happens is they said, you either can go away and live somewhere else, or you have to drink some hemlock because you're just a pain in the ass. And what they wanted him to do was go away. And he was like, fuck you. You guys should give me like room and board down at the city hall because I'm doing a service to Athens.
Wow.
And they were like, okay, asshole, now you get the hemlock.
Now you drink the hemlock. Oh, how interesting. He chose, wow, interesting. Did he think they weren't really going to do it to him, or did he not give a shit?
No, I think he knew it was coming. I think he did. I think he just didn't give a shit.
Principled stand. I mean, he's like a big fat old hippie guy, basically, kind of. He's
he
like
is.
Kind of, yeah. Amazing. And so then he teaches Plato. I mean, we don't need to linger over these guys because they're boring.
We can blow through them.
But Plato, Aristotle. What's Plato's basic sort of take?
Okay, I'll give you like 1 minute summary of Plato and Aristotle, for which they will take away my PhD. Plato believed that there was another world of perfection, the ideals, and that had a huge influence on what became Christianity and Judaism and Islam. So there's this world, but there's a much better, perfect world, and we're sort of like a bad copy of that more beautiful world.
Okay,
huge influence on all of Western thought. Then Aristotle comes along and disagrees with almost everything that his teacher taught him. Like he says, forget about another world. Just look at how, instead of thinking about what is the good in some kind of perfect idea, let's look at how human beings actually behave, and we'll see what they think is the good, and we can learn from what makes them tick, and then we can have better sort of political government and like constitutions. And so Aristotle was more of a realist, and Plato was more of an idealist.
And does Aristotle start kind of the natural sciences too? Does he start looking at things and saying, let's also just look at the material world around us? You're talking about this never world that exists somewhere else in which there's the perfect form of a cow, but I'm going to look at the actual cow and say, like, here's a cow.
Yeah, he was a biology. His dad was a doctor, and he basically was a biologist. And that tells you a big difference between him and Plato.
And is it empirical thinking? Is that what that is? Empiricism, which is like the facts that are in front of you. Is that what that means?
Yeah, I would say he was a very imperfect empirical thinker because he's looking at the facts and evidence, but he's got a whole lot of theories too that are coming down the pike.
Okay.
So he's a mix, but he's way more empirical than Plato is.
Okay. And so then we move on in time, Steve. We're journeying through time. Let's move through. And then you got the Romans. You have like, and then for the Romans, what I know is the Stoics and the Epicureans and things like that. What the Stoicism is a real philosophy that comes out of Rome. And we think of Marcus Aurelius, and we think of Cicero, and we think of all these guys in the Roman Stoicism. What's Stoicism, Professor?
No, that's a great, okay, so Marcus Aurelius.
And this is centuries later. This is centuries later. This is several centuries later. Okay.
So we're talking about like the same. Cicero's writing at the time of Caesar Augustus and Julius Caesar, and so we're now hundreds of years forward, and sometimes it's called the Hellenistic period, but this is all happening during the Roman period. And if if people think about the film Gladiator, they'll recognize that that great actor plays Marcus Aurelius, the wonderful Richard Harris, I think.
Richard Harris. That's right. Yeah. Richard Harris.
But that's very much a kind of, to be very simplistic, that kind of gladiator resolve. Like, life is shit, but I am going to get through it, and I am going to remain, and I am going to achieve my goals. And the world is buffeting me about, but I can't change that. All I can do is change how I respond to all that chaos. So you're trying to control your own mind to deal with the pain and suffering of existence. That's Stoic.
Again, it's funny how much it sounds like Buddhism to me, or like Zen
Very
Buddhism
much so.
or something. It's so interesting.
Very similar.
And I always just wonder how much was coming from other places, filtering into to these guys, and especially the Romans, who were going all over the world, or the known world, or the Roman world, and gathering all these bits and pieces of knowledge. How much stuff was maybe coming from the East? Yeah,
in trade. Yeah, trade adventures probably brought ideas together like this. But I mean, like Epictetus was himself. Epictetus writes.
Is he a Stoic?
Yeah, he's a Stoic. He writes the Enchiridion, and that's actually the thing that I think it was. Who was the guy that was stuck in the Hanoi Hilton? That politician from Texas,
McCain.
John
McCain.
And McCain and some of these other guys that ended up being prisoners of war, they were passing around the Enchiridion, this Stoic text.
Really?
It's very small. Yeah, you can memorize it. It's very small.
Wow.
And it's still very popular for soldiers. They memorize it. They think it through. They try to, if they're trapped or they're imprisoned, they'll oftentimes go through it in their head. And Epictetus was a slave. So it wasn't like philosophers are just these kind of leisure class guys in the ancient world. They're oftentimes coming from the lower classes too.
Fascinating. I did not know that. That's amazing. What's about Epicureanism? What is that?
Epicureans,
that's the Roman era too, right? That's sort of the Roman era too.
Exactly. Like the meaning it has now is like you like good food and fancy stuff. But that's the exact opposite of what Epicurean philosophy was.
And was it a guy, Epicurus? Was there a guy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Epicurus was was sort of known for two things. He thought you should be, it's just the opposite of sort of hedonism. You should be happy with bread and water. That's all you need. Then you'll never suffer. Because if you have fine taste, you're always disappointed by shit.
Fascinating. How did it get twisted to mean it's complete opposite?
To be the opposite.
How?
I think because a lot of his metaphors were about food. It's a weird sort of transformation. Became just the opposite.
It seems to me, in my vague knowledge about Epicureanism, that there's some sort of, whereas the Stoics are constantly talking about life being this struggle, it's like his seems to be about like, hey, it's all going to be okay.
Yeah.
Like, you know what? Everything's cool. We're all happy. We're all basically in a state of happiness if we just stop worrying about shit, right? There seems to be a kind of funny, he seems to, in my mind, it has this overlay of like, hey, happiness. Like, here's how you be happy.
That's true.
Instead of like, here's how you fucking get through shit. You know what I mean? It's like, so it seems maybe that's part of it too. That later.
That's true, because he said you shouldn't like worry about what's going to happen to you after you die.
Right.
Like, and whether there are gods even. Like, he's like, when that happens, you're going to be there, but you're not there now. So basically just put that out of your mind and try to lighten up. Yeah. But also, on water and bread, maybe a little cheese now and then.
A little cheese. Just a little cheese. So, okay, now where are we? We're the Romans, and we're going to jump ahead now. We're going to jump ahead probably a good distance.
Yeah, otherwise this would be like a 3-hour
Well, where are we? We haven't done it. It hasn't been that long.
No, we're doing great. We're kind of doing remarkably well. We're clocking time.
We jump ahead and we go to sort of these kind of the religious guys like Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. Yeah. And now we've got Christianity's taken over. And you have these kind of confusing to me because it's like you have these guys who seem to be theologians, but they're also philosophers. So you have somebody like, it seems to me like Thomas Aquinas is a representative guy of this era, and it's the Middle Ages. This is when? This is like...
Yeah, it's the Middle Ages. It's Aquinas is in the 12th century. Now we're all the way, like we're in the Common Era. We're in what's called AD, Anno Domini. And so we've gone basically through what's sometimes called the Dark Ages, where it's just religion.
No philosophy.
There is philosophy, but it just kind of gets brushed away, you know.
Right.
It doesn't
By the
dominate.
Vikings. The Vikings come in and just kick everybody's ass, and philosophy has no place.
Yeah, I mean, what I think that if you look at the medieval period, like Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine was actually just trying to get Christianity. He's just basically trying to baptize Plato so that Platonic ideas would be Christianity. And then like some like 700 years later, you get Aquinas, who does the same thing with Aristotle. He quote unquote baptizes Aristotle.
Interesting.
And they make, because you have to remember that the West lost all these books, and they were kept alive by the Islamic tradition in their libraries, because we lost like the Library of Alexandria and all this stuff. We had lost Aristotle and Plato. And then during the Crusades, when I say we, I mean the Western Europe basically refound these amazing texts, and they were like, oh, you know, we've got this great Bible. What the fuck is this? And it's like an encyclopedia set by a guy named Aristotle, and it just knows all this shit. So they have to do something.
Crazy to think that it had to be rediscovered, that it had been forgotten. That's so wild.
Yeah, lost.
That's so crazy to think that.
It is cool.
Now there's no conception of losing knowledge. You can't lose knowledge, except for the fact that there's so much knowledge.
Yeah.
Stuff will get
if
lost.
The internet goes down, man.
Right. Well, that's true. But it's like, that's such a wild idea to think that you could lose Aristotle. You could lose all of that thinking for hundreds of years, and you had to rediscover it. It's really cool.
It is amazing.
So he kind of applies... Yeah, no.
You have to rediscover it. You rediscover it, but then you also have to fit it in with what you think is important, and that was hard to do.
The world is completely changed now. There's a completely different religious system and everything. So he kind of applies that kind of logical thinking to religion. Am I right? Yeah. Is that a really crude way of saying it?
Exactly right. He tries to give logical arguments. Some of them are very effective. Some of them are really powerful. Like, here's why you should believe in God. Like, you know, how can there, if every event has a cause, then the universe is an event, then the universe must have a cause. Well, what could that be? It could only be God.
So he's the guy who comes up with that first cause idea.
Yes.
That like, if you keep going back through the chain of causation, of causes and effects, you're going to reach a point at which there's nothing before that. There has to be some end point.
There's other versions of it earlier, but that argument is probably, he's very good at expressing that argument. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know that that was him.
That's still compelling for a lot of people. A lot of people find that still very powerful.
Well, it's a very kind of, it's that basic sort of thing like kids do, which is the why, where they're always like, well, why?
Yeah.
And you go, well, because blah, 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 blah. Yeah, but why? And you just keep going back and back until you're just like, I have no fucking idea. I don't know what.
Stop.
Yeah, you're just like, I've hit the wall of just the uncanny now, and I have no fucking idea why. And if you're right, I don't know. There's no justification for anything I'm telling you right now except God. You know?
It stops. Well, that's called, the technical word for that is the infinite regress.
Okay.
So you just keep going back and back and back and back and back. In order to stop it, you have God there.
Ah, very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I know that you said to me last night, because there's so few women figure in the history of philosophy, that you wanted to talk about Hildegard of Bingen.
Yeah, Hildegard von Bingen.
Yeah.
This is like, it's a sad truth that it's been a male-dominated field. I mean, just like every other field until quite recently. Part of that is because women were not encouraged to do this kind of education. And part of it is that they existed, but they slipped away from the history of philosophy. Their stories aren't kept alive. And so it's important to keep, you know, shining the light on some of these great female philosophers. And Hildegard von Bingen was one of those characters, like you said, sort of part religion and part philosophy. Fantastic medieval thinker. Another one is Anne Conaway, who's a mystic from like the time of Descartes. And they were like deep thinkers applying logic, but also theology. And Hildegard also did imagery and like they did paintings and illuminated manuscripts. And she even composed music that's sometimes performed now too, celestial music. So,
and her paintings are super visionary. They're like really crazy
trippy.
looking. Yeah, they're really cool looking. It's almost, they're almost like Blake or something a little bit, right? They're a little bit like William Blake stuff later. Okay. Now we're going to jump ahead again. Now we're going to really jump ahead, I think, for quite a while. We're going to go, I guess the next guy would be René Descartes, maybe?
Yes.
Or is he the guy, or who? Spinoza, Pascal? Which guy would you tell me is the next guy to talk about?
I think Descartes probably the next really important figure. I mean, this is like, this whole conversation, which actually is going better than I expected, I have to say. But we're still like,
Steve,
we're just
ye of little faith, man. I was like, no, I was like, I'm going to ask you this shit because you're a smart guy. You're an entertaining guy. You know how to convey this stuff in really meaningful, nice way.
Well, I appreciate that.
Come on,
you're queuing it up nicely, but we're still just on a few of the branches. People could spend their whole lives chinwagging on these topics.
I know.
But
I
just Descartes.
Just to give a survey. So Descartes many centuries later, right?
Yeah, he's basically, we're talking about the 1600s in Europe. He's French Catholic, raised by Jesuits. He's eventually he goes to Northern Europe. Everybody who's persecuted or worried, of course, ends up in Amsterdam.
Well, persecuted for being Catholics.
Yeah, well, just whatever it is, honestly. Like if you just have heterodox ideas. Because Spinoza's family, they're Jewish and he has ideas and he's got to run away. His family's got to go to Amsterdam too. So just if you had outsider views, you ended up there.
That's interesting. So Amsterdam has always been this place that's kind of like all bets are off. You can kind of hang out here and
Spinoza, heroin, prostitution, it's all available.
Sure, absolutely. Get your philosophy, absolutely.
But Descartes is famous for like having this kind of mind-body problem that's been hugely influential.
Which means what?
Okay, like if you think about the movie The Matrix, people will recognize that you can be living in this world of a matrix, but you're really just like a guy in a pod. What did Patton Oswalt call it?
A brain in a jar.
Yeah, a brain in a jar. So maybe what your experience now, like we think we're having a chinwag, but actually we could be just in a matrix, or I could be asleep in bed and just having a dream of this.
Right.
And that's what Descartes said. He was like, you can't trust the senses at all. They're liars.
Wow.
You could be dreaming. You could be insane, he says.
Wow.
And you think you're having a conversation, just like that person on the bus, but you're not. So you can't trust the senses at all. What can you trust, he says, is just the mind, is rationality, reason. In fact, he even invents this evil genius. So he says, imagine God, but he's evil. He's totally fucking with you. So even if you add like 2 + 2 and you get 4, he says, you can even doubt that because the evil genius, 2 + 2 could actually be 5, but every time you do the calculation, he takes 1 away.
Wow.
So even math can't be trusted. This is all Descartes in the Meditations. It's crazy.
Super paranoid.
Yeah. And it influenced science fiction. I mean, look at how much science fiction is based on.
That's true. That's really true. I'd never thought of that.
Yeah.
That's so true. So, and then he posits this, I think, therefore I am, the cogito ergo sum thing.
Yes.
I think, therefore I am, because my brain functions, I can apply logic and I can sort of, is that why? Because I can
he says, even if I'm being deceived in the matrix or by an evil God, every time there has to be something there to be deceived. So every time I think, I'm proving that I exist, at least for that moment.
Wow.
So even if I'm doubting that I exist, the doubt, somebody's doing the doubting. So that's the one bit of certainty he thinks he has.
Holy shit. That's such an intense.
Is that crazy?
Wow, it's so paranoid, really. It's just
it's
like,
super paranoid.
Holy cow. I'll tell you, the one thing I remember about Descartes learning is that he invented the necktie. That's
Did he really? I didn't know that.
I think he made like
claim
ties.
to fame.
He made cravats or ties or something. There's some vague thing about how he made the tie, the necktie, sort of like a popular thing.
Holy
I don't know if it's fucking true or not, but I like it.
I believe it.
That's amazing. So, okay, so he says that. Who else? Then we have like Spinoza, who's a name you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Who's contemporary or a little bit later than him?
Just a little bit after Descartes. He was influenced by Descartes, but he's considered sort of that same school. And that school is called the rationalists. Mm-hmm. They think you know everything through the mind directly. And it's the opposite of that empirical knowledge we were talking about before, that Aristotle sort of uses his senses and tries to understand the world. These guys are sitting in a chair just thinking really hard. So you have Descartes, you have Leibniz, you have Spinoza, and they come up with some wacky shit that is also really kind of cool. Spinoza says there's one God and it is the same thing as nature. So he calls this Deus sive natura. And it's just like one block of reality, and we're just a tiny part of that. And so you have like part of the world is material and part of it is immaterial or mind. And we're just like, imagine like blood cells in a giant organism, basically. And also he says, you think you're free, but actually all of this is determined by laws of nature that God basically imbues all of reality with. So you don't really have the kind of freedom you think you have. And so your job, according to Spinoza, is to realize that you have this, it's called Of Human Bondage. There's like some wonderful books written about human bondage that comes from this, that great British writer, I think we both like, writes Of Human Bondage.
Somerset Maugham.
Somerset Maugham.
Yeah.
And basically it's like this, you think you make your destiny, but Spinoza thinks if you understood that you're made up of all these like springs and mechanisms of emotions and thoughts, then you can begin to clarify those. And that's the only freedom you're really going to have, is you'll understand like, oh, I get really angry when this happens. And I should know that about myself. And that gives me some sort of clarity or detachment on myself.
Oh, interesting.
And that he thinks he was also influenced by the Stoics, as you can see.
So the only
get your mind right.
Right. So the only freedom you have is to step aside and observe what's happening and understand that that's what's happening, but you can't change it, really.
That's right.
Holy shit. That's so fucking weird. It's so paranoid. That's the thing. There's such a weird...
That's the lesson of this whole tour of philosophy.
It gets more and more paranoid as it goes on. It's like, give me the guys who are like, everything's water. I'm like, that's way better. Like, I can deal with these guys. Are terrifying. It gets more and more...
Here's one. Let me, in their defense, he does say weird stuff like, he says, the more you do know these things about yourself that you can't change, he says, the more you have vitality. He says everything operates by this principle he calls conatus, which is striving. Like you strive to survive, like you and I do, but even the grass is trying to break through the cement, you know?
Oh, interesting.
And he says, the more you understand, the more vitality you have. And then that's your only attempt at happiness, is that.
And you're striving towards God? I mean, it's like, what are you reaching for?
Yeah, the more you understand, the more you become God-like. And that's the relationship you can have with God. It's not personal. He's not a personal God. He doesn't care about you. He's not like looking out for you.
Okay, fair enough. Wow.
That was kind of amazing. Oh my God.
Well, and I should say, it culminates in the Chinwag, baby. Here it is. And there's still people I wanted to know about, like Wittgenstein and Heidegger, but that's okay. We don't need to talk about those guys. Wow, that was something else.
I appreciate your patience and your great questions.
No, I mean,
awesome.
It's like, to me, it's like, I just thought, we have a philosopher sitting here. We might as well fucking find out what the hell's going on. Yeah.
Really fun to do.
Yeah.
I hope people enjoy it.
Yeah.
Got something out of it.
Totally. I sure did. Well, that was a ton of fun. We really hope you enjoyed this Chinwag. Thank you for listening. We have bonus content coming your way in a few days, so please keep an eye out for that. And don't forget to like us, follow us, rate us, and review us. All that kind of good stuff. We'd love to hear from you. And until next time, wag on.
Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films. Hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma. Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein. Original theme music by Luke Topp, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Audio production supervision by Matt Dyson. Editing and mixing by Jeff Neal. Animation created by Alex Sokol. Research assistance by Aidan Brooks. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.